Hi there! Today we're going to be talking about ancient Greek temples. Ancient Greek temples are a distinct style of architecture unlike anything we really have in the modern world because of a few reasons. How they were used, where they are, and how they were decorated. So, what is a Greek temple? When we talk about a Greek temple, what we're talking about is essentially four rectangular walls made out of marble surrounded by a portico. And a portico is essentially a covered area with columns at equal spaces in between. And because of this portico feature, a lot of people think that the columned halls in Egypt and Mesopotamia are the origins of the Greek temple. And why are they called Greek temples? They're called Greek temples because they're the products of the Greek-speaking peoples who inhabited the Mediterranean region between about 800 and either 323 BC or 146 BC or BCE. And so why the different dates? Well, some people think the end of the Greek period is when Alexander the Great died in 323 and divided up his kingdom among different rulers and in Egypt. And then elsewhere in the Greek world, it was like this massive kingdom, and it kind of was the end of this unified Greek rule. And 146, alternately, is when the Romans defeated the city-state of Corinth, which was at the head of the Achaean League, which was essentially basically comprised the area of Greece. And so some people say 323, some people say 146. But suffice it to say that between 800 and anywhere between 3 and 100 BCE is kind of when these Greek temples were being built. And the Roman architecture is obviously takes a lot from Greek architecture, but there are some notable differences. So the plan of a Greek temple looks like this. And the corresponding building is this one here in this photograph. And these images represent the Temple of Concord at Agrigento, or ancient Acragas. It's just hard to say. That's probably why they changed the name. And this is in Sicily. So as you can see, the dots represent the little columns, and there are 6 in the front. And this brings up an important point about Greek temples. They're not just in Greece. They're anywhere, all over the Mediterranean world where these Greek-speaking people lived, including Turkey, North Africa, and Sicily. In fact, some of the best preserved ones are in Sicily, like this one here. So, what are the different kinds of Greek temples? There are 3 canonical types of Greek temples known as orders. The Temple of Concord, our first example, belongs to what is called the Doric order. And the three orders are Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. And to identify and explain the differences in between them, we need a few kind of vocabulary terms, though there are tons more than we need to know right here. And the main elements from the ground up are the stereobate, the stylobate and the steps in between them, and the columns and the bases that the columns sit on, and the capitals, what's above the columns, and the entablature, this area here, and the pediment up here, this triangle part. And so this Doric order is the first to appear historically. It's named for the area in which the Doric Greek was spoken, specifically the southern part of the Mediterranean, including the island of Rhodes. So with this diagram and with this example, we can see that the Doric columns have no base and the shafts are fluted. And here's the original. It's more difficult to see, obviously, in the photograph. And the capitals, too, very distinctively, are pretty straight. You can see up here. They're pretty simple compared to the other 2 orders. And the sculptural ornamentation comprise what are called triglyphs and metopes. The triglyphs refer to the straight vertical bars, and the metopes to the spaces in between them. And they occasionally had figures in them divided into blocks, sort of like comic books. And it's not as though Doric temples all of a sudden stopped being produced and ancient architects uniformly switched to another style. But the next to develop gradually, historically, what is the Ionic order. And this takes its name from the region of Ionia, which is basically modern-day Western Turkey. And these, returning to our diagram, are characterized over here on the left by Ionic volutes. And a really nice example of this is the Temple of Magnesia on the Meander in Turkey. And here's a photo, and it's not a great preserved temple, although you can really clearly see the Ionic volutes up here. And as shown in this schematic drawing, they had a frieze up here. And unlike triglyphs and metopes, this was continuous. And sometimes there was sculpture, sometimes there wasn't. But even very often there was something, even if no sculpture, there was like very often what's called an egg and dart motif. In art historical terms, this is just the name of the motif, and this is what it looks like up close. You've probably seen it on all sorts of modern buildings too. And, okay, the last of the three is Corinthian, and it's named for Corinth, which is the area which separates mainland Greece from the Peloponnese, and it's still called modern Corinth. It's still called Corinth today in Greece. And this is the most elaborate and the last to develop historically. Most Roman temples, in fact, belong to the Corinthian order. And so Corinthian temples generally have a multi-stepped base and capitals, which have a very detailed sculpture of acanthus leaves. One of the best surviving examples is the Temple of Olympian Zeus at Athens, where you can kind of see how even in this poor photograph, for which I apologize, you can see like the acanthus leaves on the top. And it's kind of cool. The story behind this is that a young girl passed away and her nurse brought her remains to a tomb, and then out of the basket where her remains were, acanthus leaves grew out, and a Greek architect, doesn't matter, his name is Callimachus, but they say it doesn't matter, saw it and decided that he would reproduce it in stone and develop this new order. And so how were these Greek temples built? As it turns out, with a great amount of expertise and attention to detail. The lines appear straight, but they're not in fact straight. They swell slightly in the middle, kind of like a balloon. And additionally, the steps are not totally level, but they're higher in the center. And so this technique architecturally is called entasis, and an exaggerated image of it is here. And obviously the temples don't actually look like this, but again, this is like it's distorted for kind of like educational purposes. And what it does is it gives the temples a feeling of buoyancy and a little bit less, it's a lightness that they perceived, and I think that truly is borne out that you can see today. So if so much planning went into them, how were these temples used? They were places of ancient worship. However, unlike Christian churches, the visitors didn't enter them or Muslim mosques or anything. They're kind of like I said in the beginning, they're kind of like a world apart in this regard. The temple, the god was thought to inhabit the inner part of the temple, like called the naos. And again, people didn't go outside. They made votive offerings at altars which were outside of the temple. They usually burned meat or something or brought candles or something like that. It seems surprising to us today because churches are a place where people gather and worship. And of course, they do this inside for the most part. Ancient visitors who made these votive offerings usually requested something of the relevant god. And we're not going to talk about all of the pagan gods and their associations now, but for example, someone who's expecting a child might pray to Artemis at her temple, the Temple of Artemis. There are several, but the one famous one is in Ephesus in Western Turkey, where, like I said, there are a lot of Ionic temples. And so these differences between, I'll get that chart again, these differences between, among the Doric, Corinthian, and Ionic columns or orders are not hard and fast, but the distinctions and the identifying features are. So a great example of breaking this rule is the Parthenon. It's one of the most famous Greek temples, and it's actually a kind of a mix of both orders. And here's the ancient example. And you can see there's a full-scale replica here, which shows the sculptural ornamentation better. But as you can see, it has both the triglyphs and metopes and also the frieze. And so it kind of combines features from Ionic and the Doric orders. And finally, who or what was in the sculptural representation? Well, here, looking at this reconstructed photo, again, you can see that there was sophisticated sculpture and ornamentation up at the pediment. And generally, they showed sculpture with anything except scenes from actual history. So we might be used to going to public buildings like banks or museums or libraries and seeing painted scenes of events that actually took place, sometimes in living memory, like George Washington crossing the Delaware or soldiers raising the flag, like at the Marine Corps Memorial. But the figures of ancient Greek temples were solely they inhabited like a mythical space. Here's an example from the Parthenon. The figures these are the figures in the metopes, and this shows the mythical battle between the lapis and the centaurs. I really like this piece. And the images on the pediment, that triangle part, they're reproduced here. And they show the contest of Athena and Poseidon for the patronship of Athens, and the birth of Athena. And so again, this is kind of like scenes from the Old Testament would be in our public buildings today. And the temples were also colored with bright blue and red colors. So we kind of have to imagine away the stark, bright white marble, which is beautiful in its own right, but not how an ancient visitor would have seen it. It would have been more like a brightly colored Victorian home or a bungalow in California, though of course the purpose was totally different. So why should we care? When we see Greek revival buildings, we can identify particular types. Like modern buildings use these orders and bear them out today. So here's a little quiz. Can you tell which order this building is? This is the Duke Energy Building in Cincinnati. This is a Doric order. And so you might recognize this building. It's the U.S. Supreme Court building, and it is the Corinthian order. And then last but not least, this is a very cool building. This is the law school at the University of Norway. And seeing the volutes, you can tell it's Ionic. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again.